It was a doctor's order, a holy duty. For widows and virgins, this is where it gets clinical. Midwives were licensed to perform manual stimulation to provoke the necessary paroxysm of release. Yes, you heard that. Medical orgasms, prescribed like a tonic, performed by a healthcare professional. The machines we would later call vibrators didn't fall from the sky. They were invented to meet this medical demand. You see the loop? Morality represses. Medicine pathologizes. The system tries to impose order on a basic human need, and it is constantly, violently, cracking at the seams. And here is where the seams cracked wide open. The trial by Congress. A wife, trapped in a loveless and sexless marriage, sues for annulment. Her only legal avenue. Her husband is impotent. But the court, obsessed with tangible proof, needed to see it, to believe it. The couple was brought to a private, often cold room in the bishop's palace. A panel of matrons, older, widowed women deemed experts, was brought in. They would begin with a physical exam, inspecting the husband's genitals. They might attempt manual arousal to see if there was a response. If that was inconclusive, the main event began. The couple was ordered into bed. A curtain was drawn. A curtain with peepholes. The matrons gathered around, pressing their eyes to the holes, and watched. The pressure was crushing. The case of the Marquis de Langley in the 17th century became a scandal. He, under the cold gaze of the old women, wilted like a flower, failing time and time again. He later remarried and had children, but at that moment, the humiliation defined him. When justice becomes a pornographic play, the human body is just a prop. Sexual punishments in this era were not private. They craved the public square. Humiliation was part of the sentence. An adulterous woman wasn't just fined. In some regions, she had her nose cut off. Why the nose? It is the center of the face. To cut off the nose was to permanently destroy her beauty. It was an unhideable brand, stamping her as a sexual criminal for life. Every time she stepped out into the cold, she would have to cover her face, not from the frost, but from the shame. And we know this is real. Archaeologists have found female skulls from this period, the nasal bones cleanly, coldly sliced away. This wasn't an empty threat. It was a technique of power, enforced by shame, to remind everyone else to behave. And then, when the cold and isolation of winter blurred the lines between reason and madness, we get the surreal, the trials of animals. Bestiality was considered the ultimate sin. It shattered God's order. The punishment? Death by fire. For both. But here's the unhinged part. The animal was a co-defendant. It was brought to court. It was assigned a lawyer. Witnesses were called to testify to its character. In one famous French case, a donkey was charged alongside a man. The man was sentenced to burn. But the donkey? The entire village came to court to vouch for its virtue. They testified it was a hard-working, gentle animal and had clearly been forced. The court found the donkey not guilty. The man burned alone. In another case, a pig was found guilty. Before its execution, it was dressed in human clothes. Why? To emphasize that it had participated in a human sin. These trials weren't jokes. They were purification rituals. The community believed the sinful act had polluted the air, and to restore order and perhaps ensure a better harvest, the unclean vessel had to be destroyed. The cold wasn't just outside. It was in the law. In Florence, the fear of homosexuality, seen as unnatural and anger-inducing to God, was so great that they created the office of the night, literally, the sex police. They were ghosts in the winter night. They patrolled known cruising spots. They placed anonymous denunciation boxes around the city where anyone could drop a note accusing their neighbor. They even used honey traps, employing beautiful young men as bait to entrap older gentlemen. Over decades, tens of thousands of men were investigated. Thousands were convicted. Their records are clinically cold. Who was active? Who was passive? Where did they meet? How often? First-timers were fined. Repeat offenders were branded with hot irons, pilloried, or executed. When society is in a panic, especially when the Black Death hit, it always looks for a scapegoat. The court in Bruges burned a man alive, claiming his unnatural lust had poisoned the air and caused the plague. When disaster strikes, you need a sinner to blame, and sex is always the easiest brick to throw. The Knights Templar, once an unstoppable army, were brought down in part by sexual accusations, forcing initiates to kiss their superiors' anus orgies. Torture makes you say anything. But the charges worked because society was already primed to believe heresy equals sexual deviancy. The peak of this obsession was the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. This book, written by inquisitors, claimed that witches could steal men's penises. They didn't just steal them, they collected them. The book describes witches gathering 20 or 30 members in a bird's nest and feeding them oats and corn. And this was illustrated. We have murals and manuscripts depicting women standing under a tree, but instead of apples, the tree is heavy with penises. They are harvesting them. This sounds like a sick joke, but the judges weren't laughing. The priests weren't laughing. They believed it. And thousands of women, usually lonely elderly widows, were brutally tortured until they confessed to stealing penises, and they were burned for it. When reason freezes, paranoia takes root. Now let's debunk some myths. The Lord's First Night, Droit du Seigneur, almost certainly fiction, later propaganda. Medieval chastity belts, all 19th century fakes or Renaissance jokes. But the truth, as always, is weirder. The truth was the city-run, church-licensed brothel. In Southwark, London, the brothels were called the Bishop of Winchester's geese because they sat on his land and he collected taxes from them. A perfect system. Preach against sin on Sunday and profit from it Monday through Saturday. These brothels had rules. In Nuremberg, Jewish clients were charged double. Prostitutes had to wear identifiers, those yellow hoods, tinkling in the snow. And in a surreal display of diplomacy, when the emperor visited, it was the prostitutes who captured him at the gates with golden chains as a formal welcome. When you can't erase vice, the system chooses to regulate it, tax it, and build cathedrals with the profits. This bizarre, hypocritical, and pragmatic system ran for centuries, and then, in 1494, it shattered. Not from a moral reformation, but from an uninvited guest from the New World, syphilis. It spread like fire in a dry winter forest, from Naples to Scotland in just a few years. Sores, rashes, and the horrifying sight of flesh literally rotting off a living person's face. Sex, which had been a redeemable sin, suddenly became a lethal one. Cities frantically shut down the brothels they had licensed for centuries. Noble marriages were called off when the groom showed symptoms. The fear of biology finally did what thousands of sermons on morality could not. It forced the entire system to stop. You might ask, so were medieval people hypocrites or pragmatists? The answer is in the middle. They were human. They set up laws to contain instinct, then built valves to release the pressure. Confession and penance, banned lists and licensed brothels. When their science was blind, it became a bludgeon for injustice. When their courts craved proof, they turned the human body into a stage. When their communities were scared, they sacrificed the other. The history of medieval sex is the history of a machine trying to turn instinct into a formula. The formula broke. The people remained. And in the storm of facts, what hooks us isn't just the shock. It's the feeling of seeing ourselves in a distorted mirror. You made it to the end of this journey. Thank you for your courage. If you want to keep peeling back the unromantic, unflinching layers of the past, support the channel. If this disturbing journey through medieval sexuality fascinated you, check out my video on the shocking sexual scandals of the Borgia popes, where we explore what happens when the most powerful religious figure on earth stops pretending to be celibate entirely.